to you these two wonderful women, Claudia Gray and Kimberla Lawson Roby. We'll get to them in just a minute. I want to introduce them, and I'll let them talk because I know you're here to hear them, not me. But before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you do have a cell phone or device on you, please silence it at this time, just so it doesn't catch us off guard. And there will be a chance after we've had a discussion for you to ask questions. So while we're talking and while they're telling you about their books, please be thinking of your questions. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited to get to introduce these two lovely ladies to you today. Claudia Gray is visiting us from New Orleans today. We were talking about that earlier, and she lives there with her husband and a host of rescue dogs. And she's the writer of multiple young adult fiction. And so you might be familiar with some of her work. It's all paranormal fiction, the Evernight series, the Firebird series, Constellation series. If we have any YA fans out here, you don't have to be young to be a fan of YA. I read YA all the time. She's also written a few Star Wars novels for all of you sci-fi fans out there. And then Kimberla Lawson Roby is visiting us from Illinois today. And she is the best-selling author of both novels and nonfiction. And she's got too many awards to her name for me to even list. That would take me probably about the first 30 minutes of the session if I try to do all of that. But she is a New York Times bestseller. And she's an inspirational public speaker. And she also runs on her website a community for women to uplift and support women. It's called The Sisterhood. I recommend you go check that out if you haven't. So welcome, ladies. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, and I'm going to show you really quickly their novels. This is Kimberla's. And we have Claudia's here. So you will have a chance afterwards to purchase these novels and get them signed by the authors. So we thought we'd kind of start, a lot of times authors do readings, but we thought we'd kind of start with, instead of a reading, letting them kind of explain, give you a little synopsis of what their books are about. So whoever would like to go first, take over.
Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. It's wonderful to be here in Little Rock again after actually a few years. I'm thinking the last 4 or 5 years was the last time I was here, and as Amy said, to be able to do an in-person event. My latest book is my 29th title. It's entitled Sister Friends Forever. It centers on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is sisterhood. And so I wanted to write a story that really represented my own circle of women friends who are sisters, those women who you love, they love you as much unconditionally. These are the women and the sisters in your life that you get to choose. And so in most cases, those are not necessarily biological women. But the difference with this story, and this was the part that I wanted to write about on purpose, this was the part that I really focused on, was that these 4 women are now 40 years old, and while they have been best friends since they were small girls and grew up together in the same city, they even went to separate colleges, but now they have made their home back in their hometown with their families and with each other. But they're living very different lives, and they each represent the 4 relationship statuses. Serena is single, never been married, and sort of has a problem with that because she really wants to find a husband. She really wants to be married. And then Michelle is now engaged for the very first time and about to be married, but her first love has sort of re-entered the picture. I guess that's kind of a nice way for me to put it. Kenya is happily married, has 2 small children, but the whole blended family philosophy is not really working out because her husband's ex-wife is doing everything she can to just basically steal joy and peace from every single one of them. And then finally, Lynette is divorced and now trying to navigate what it's like to, first of all, go through a divorce, what it's like to now be a single mother again, and what it's like to now even think about getting back out on the dating scene. But through it all, you get to see how these women stick together as best friends and how they support each other, and they are there for each other no matter what.
And I will add really quickly that, as with all of her books, every single character, she told you a little bit about the characters, but every single one of the women in her book are completely relatable to everyone out there. I guarantee men, you'll even find relatable characters in there. All right, turn it over to you.
All right, this is my 20-something book. I've lost count in there somewhere. Also, like, do you count the graphic novels? I don't know. But I've written up to now either fantasy or science fiction, or in the case of Star Wars, science fantasy. But I've always been a big fan of both Jane Austen and Agatha Christie. Now, the idea for this book came about, I think it was about 12 or 13 years ago. The great mystery novelist P.D. James comes out with Death Comes to Pemberley. Now, as a big P.D. James fan also, you cannot imagine how excited I was for this. And I start reading this book, and I'm going, and spoilers, but this book has been out for 13 years, guys. The person who's killed is Denny, who is a very minor character in Pride and Prejudice. And I was just flummoxed. I was like, who cares who killed Denny? I'd been so sure it was going to be Mr. Wickham, so sure, and everybody had a motive. Nobody likes this guy. But I learned actually a lesson from that I found really valuable. If you, as a reader or a viewer or a listener, if somebody's creative decision irks you in this one certain way, it's not necessarily that creator made a mistake. Your creative self is knocking at the door. It's like you would have started from the same place and gone a slightly different direction, and that direction is really powerful to you. And this was, I think, really the thing that made me realize that. And over time I thought, okay, well then how do I build that? How do I capture some of this? You know, Christie was the natural thing to mix it with because, as I was saying earlier, Jane Austen and Agatha Christie were the two great English novelists who loved to trap a bunch of emotionally repressed people in a house and see what happens. Yeah, and I thought, okay, you know what? I'm gonna try and have kind of Austen's wit, but Christie's consequences. So we have characters tied to each of Jane Austen's 6 complete novels are brought together at the country home of Emma and Mr. Knightley. And it's been varying degrees of time since the books. I placed them throughout the Regency era, roughly, but not exactly the way that Jane Austen wrote them. But I thought, when is it most interesting to catch up with these people? I had them there. Wickham shows up. He is, of course, the uninvited guest. And in the tradition of Jane Austen's baddies and a lot of Christie's rogues, it turns out he has more than one scheme going on at a time, which means, for various reasons, everyone in that house has a reason to loathe him. You know, dark and stormy night, he winds up dead. The only 2 people who can be excluded are Juliet Tilney, who's the daughter of Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland from Northanger Abbey, and Jonathan Darcy, who is the son of Elizabeth and Darcy, of course. And they realize that the local law enforcement, they're assuming, oh, it's a servant or a vagrant. And they know some person who had nothing to do with this is going to be, picked up and hanged if they don't step in. So they begin doing this. And of course, part of the challenge is the very strict rules of Regency society. How do you manage to investigate without tripping over all of these many, many etiquette pitfalls? And I got to have a whole lot of fun with it.
I didn't, just like a good Agatha Christie novel, I had no idea who it was until the very end. I thought it was everybody. I'm like, they all got together and killed him. And I've always loathed him too, so I was kind of glad to see him finally get his comeuppance. I'll admit it. All right, I'm going to kind of get things started with, I've got a few questions for these ladies, and I'm going to ask a couple of them just so I can be selfish and kind of get some of the answers. But like I said, I want y'all to be thinking about your questions also. So actually, Claudia, I'll start with you. Did it make you nervous to tackle these characters? I mean, Austenites, that's a hardcore fan base. Did it make you nervous at all to kind of tackle these characters and revamp them and reimagine them and put them in your own setting, in your own kind of little world there?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's completely terrifying. If you want to talk about two masters of their individual craft, Jane Austen, I mean, she's so funny, she's so insightful. Can you think of another book of comparable age that is still read regularly just for fun? No, there's nothing even close. You know, it's almost another half century before you get things, you know, and people do still read, say, like Dickens or some Emily Bronte for fun, but even that comes a lot later. And it's nothing like the popularity that Jane Austen still has. And it's because she is both so very funny, and she's able to work in these little insights and jokes and et cetera without ever interrupting the flow of her narrative, which is... It's the kind of thing that until you've tried it, you don't realize it's really, really hard to do. And then Agatha Christie, I knew that I loved her, and then I started writing a mystery, and I was like, this woman is such a genius. How did she do it? Because it's hard, y'all. And, you know, I've reread a bunch of her work and realized how, again, and it's sort of ironically kind of the same technique. You're dropping all this incredibly important stuff while, you know, a narrative flows onward the same way, and you absorb it as you go, you know, the difference being that you don't quite put it together with Agatha Christie. So yeah, that was terrifying, and honestly, my first thought when I very, very first was thinking about it was like, well, I should write that as fanfic, because I have written a lot of fanfic, y'all. But as time went on, I was like, no, I think I could do it, but I was nervous about it and about how it would be received. So, you know, but there's nothing to do except release it into the wild. And luckily, the response has mostly been really great. And I think for me, at least like emotionally, the real proof came when our local Jane Austen Society invited my husband and I to their annual Jane Austen champagne jazz brunch at Commander's Palace for her birthday this year. So yeah, I was like, okay, at least
So
got a
you were
brunch out of it.
accepted.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I will say that all the people I know who are huge fans of Jane Austen and or Agatha Christie, and I've just showed them the book and said, just read the back. And they all are like, oh my gosh, this sounds amazing. So I think, I'm not surprised it's getting a great reception, because you did it very well. There were times where I thought I might have been reading Jane Austen, so you had the voice down pat, in my opinion.
Thank you. I only wish, but I'm glad that it at least has some of the flavor of that. And also, I think even there are some Austen fans who don't read any of the other fiction, because there's tons of other fiction that's been written about those characters, about Jane Austen herself. There's one where Jane Austen is a vampire, and she comes into a bookstore where they're selling like Jane Austen spinoffs, and so she eats the bookseller. You know, yeah, they mentioned that to me at a book event in a bookstore, and I was like, "Are you warning me? What's happening here?" So you worry about that, but I think just the fact that Mr. Wickham gets murdered, I think some people that don't normally see it, they're like, yeah, but I want to see that guy get his.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Kimberla, my question for you. So you write about some really sensitive topics: with addiction, mental illness, infidelity, cancer. I don't want to make it sound depressing, because it's really not. Our books are not. They're very, very uplifting, but you know, there are some tough topics tackled in your books, but you do manage to approach them with, and I guess my best way to describe it is just very sensitively, very gently, and with a lot of grace. But knowing that you are writing about some of those things, what's your approach to writing about those kind of difficult topics?
So I start with every storyline by thinking about which topics I really want to focus on in the book. So at that point, I've not thought about really who the characters are going to be, haven't thought about the plotting, the storyline at all. So I have this old, really frayed notebook that I've had for many years, and I've always added certain topics to it. I'll just write it down when I think about it. So when I'm ready to sit down and write a book, I'll go through that notebook, and whatever really hits me at that moment, usually 2 or 3, topics. I'm either thinking, okay, this has really, really been in the news lately, or wow, this just happened to a family member or friend, or gosh, you know what, I kind of just experienced something like this, and I'm not really seeing a lot in terms of the fiction that I'm reading, or sometimes a very controversial or taboo subject that I don't feel like we talk about a lot as human beings, but we certainly need to. And so once I decide what those topics are, that's when I start building the characters and thinking about who they are, what they do, who they don't like. Do they have a great relationship with their parents? Have they not spoken to their siblings in the last 20 years? Are they divorced? Have they been married 2 or 3 times? Whatever, all of the characteristics that we can think of. And then from there, I start outlining the stories. And so what really sent me on this journey of writing about real life social issues in a fictional format was after I wrote the first book. The feedback that I received more often than not from my readers, because I was just polling people, what made you keep reading? And trying to really figure out what really worked with this. And the response was always, I could relate to the characters and what they had experienced, or I knew someone really close to me who had. And so it really was writing about something that really could happen, or it might be something that if you have not experienced it, you're likely going to at some point in your life. And so I decided to continue that. Mm-hmm.
All right, my next question for you. You include a character in your novel who is neurodivergent. And again, I think you handle that beautifully. And it was, like I said, it was just handled so, it was just seamlessly woven into the storyline without kind of standing out, but it was still a very important part of the storyline. So tell me a little bit about your decision to include neurodivergence in one of the main characters of the book, and what that was like for you.
Okay. I didn't set out to do it at first. My first thought was that, I thought, well, Juliet Tilney will be the daughter of Henry and Catherine Tilney, and so I wanted to have some of Catherine's sort of imaginativeness and spirit and energy. And I thought, okay, Jonathan will be more Darcy than Darcy. That was what I started with. But then I started writing that, and if you get more Darcy than Darcy, then you begin to have these things, because Darcy doesn't pick up on some really significant conversational clues that say maybe Elizabeth isn't going to marry him yet. But so I realized, wait a minute, could this be what's happening with this character? And I really thought about it for a while, and I realized it was actually going to be a super interesting thing to do if I could do it correctly, because with period fiction, and I think pretty much all writers and readers do this to some extent. With period fiction, we want characters to push against some of the rules that we don't have anymore. We don't like them. A lot of times we don't like them for very good reasons. We want to see pushback from that. But while this is not true for all neurodivergent people by any means, many neurodivergent people, because subtler cues are sometimes harder to pick up, rules and specific patterns of conduct and behavior are very helpful. And I realized this is a character in a period piece who is going to love the exact stuff that we tend to push against, because that's what helps him navigate. And also I realized it's going to make him much more attuned to when somebody fudges one of those rules a little bit. The sort of thing that, polite people otherwise overlook. To him, it stands out. Now, I did a lot of reading books and online blogs and accounts from neurodivergent people because, I wanted to be as accurate as I could be. We also got an authenticity read after the fact that went really well, and she was able to point out, it's interesting because you talked before, it's so important, edits, the bad editors only tell you what you got wrong. You need to know what you got right. Mm-hmm. That's where you need to push in. And she was like, this is good. I can tell you researched this, et cetera, et cetera. And then she had some suggestions where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, he ought to react to that. Or I didn't take a couple of suggestions because a couple times she indicated ways that his parents, who love him and accept him, but how they could react a little bit better. And I didn't take those because nobody is ever going to know that Jonathan Darcy is neurodivergent. That is not a frame of reference that they have. That's not a way that this is thought about. His behaviors are considered peculiar, and his family and his social position allow them to, accept and work with some of it, but the world at large is never going to fully get that. And I was like, there needs to still be some rough terrain. Even if his parents have done pretty well, they don't have this framework. They can't really understand it. And so I let that be a little rough in a couple of sections. But I'm really glad that you've enjoyed that, and I've actually gotten very good feedback from neurodivergent readers. So that made me really happy, because that was, it was very nerve-wracking. But I think it's important because a couple people have said, like, oh, you're talking about something they didn't talk about then. And I was like, no, I'm writing about something they didn't write about then. There were neurodivergent people. How did they make their way in that world? And it was interesting to think about that.
Very well done. And I couldn't imagine him being any other way in that book. He was perfect as he was. Kimberly, you mentioned your first book a few minutes ago. Your first book got rejected over and over and over, right? Yeah. You ended up self-publishing it. Now you're a New York Times bestseller. So tell us a little bit about that journey and maybe how it affected you, how it affected your work, and the lessons that you learned from that you can kind of give us that wisdom.
Sure. Yeah, it definitely was a different kind of journey than what I expected, and I share with folks all the time how naive I was in the process, and thinking, wow, I'm finally going to sit down and write this first book, and started doing it while still working full-time. I was working as a financial analyst for city government, so it had absolutely nothing to do with writing fiction. And so moved forward with it, started writing in April 1995, and I just made it my priority. I wrote every evening, every weekend, throughout the holidays, and finished the book by the end of the year. And throughout that process, I had also been researching on how to get published. And what I had learned was that, for the most part, publishers in New York really want you to have a literary agent. They don't want to receive what they call unsolicited manuscripts. So I thought, okay, start researching literary agents who seem to be representing authors who are writing contemporary women's fiction. And so at the end of that year, I compiled a listing of 14 of them, sent out my query letters, in some cases included chapters, and sat back and waited. And one of the things I share all the time is I thought, gosh, I probably shouldn't have done that, because if I've sent it to 14 of them, how am I going to choose one and turn down the other 13? And so that's how naive I was in my thinking. And readers may not know that side of it, but other writers are very quick to understand what I'm saying, like, oh my gosh, those rejection letters just started rolling in, one after another, until I was rejected by every single one of them. And that's when the reality set in, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is not going to be as easy as I had hoped. And but I'm not going to give up quite yet, even though I'm disappointed. I'll start sending it directly to the publishing houses. They don't want that, but I don't really have anything to lose. Again, rejected by every single one, and decided to give up at that point, and was ready to move on. Started applying to MBA programs, was accepted to them, chose one, even enrolled in my first course. I thought, it's like, get back to what I'm doing and maybe go back to corporate America. And my mom realized I was serious at that point, and she's like, gosh, I don't think you should give up. We've passed around too many copies of your manuscript, and people were saying they couldn't put it down. I know nothing about publishing, she said, but I think that means something, and you shouldn't give up. And my same story is, but my mom had me thinking at this age I could do anything. So yeah, if it was awful, she was not going to tell me that. So I didn't know how much of that I could really believe. And so I appreciated her support, like always. But then my husband said, why can't you take your business background, start your own company, and publish the book yourself? And that's how the whole idea of self-publishing came about. I knew nothing about it, studied, researched, bought every book that I could on it, moved forward. Long story short, did an opening reception at home, and I tell people your plan, and I believe for me, and with my faith, that God has a plan in place for you even when you don't realize it, because it did not hurt that I worked at City Hall and I saw the mayor and knew him well, and that one of our state assemblymen used to be the attorney who reviewed my contracts for community development. And so when I was able to say that they would be at my opening reception, the entire media got on board, and 500 people came out to my first event. That night, went back to literary agents once that first 3,000 copies started to sell. This time a literary agent said yes. She sold the second book that I had not even written, then sold the first one, and then now I've had these contracts with Kensington and HarperCollins and Hachette Book Group ever since. Yeah.
So, all right, now I'm going to kind of turn it over to the audience and see who might have a question. If you want, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can just stand right up and ask away. Yes, sir.
Well, this is a question for both of you. What is the most difficult part of the writing process for both of you?
I think almost every writer will tell you, beginnings and endings are one thing. It's the middle of the book where the problems come in. A writer friend of mine, Charles Ardai, who writes and publishes the Hard Case Crime series. He writes mysteries. I believe he's won an Edgar, but one time I asked him, it was like, well, how's the book going? And he was just totally cheerful. He's like, oh, it's at the point where it's the worst book ever written and I should give up forever right now. And I was like, oh, that's normal. That's just a normal stage of it. If you just recognize that, that helps a lot. On the micro level, sometimes it's so weird. I don't think many readers realize sometimes it's not the big emotional moments. It's like, how did they get into the room? How did they get out of the room? Little things about physical moments. I mean, you're trying to minimize some of that in a lot of writing, but some of it you have to have, and it's amazing how much that stuff can trip you up, or how much time you could spend like, no, not that way to the door. It's hilarious if it's not you.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because that is my part. So the beginning and the end, sometimes the middle, but sometimes for me, the ending is the toughest, because I'm frustrated that I've opened, as you said, all these doors, and I've got to figure out how to close every last one of them, and I can't just close them, they have to make sense. It can't be contrived, because your readers are certainly not going to be okay with that. And so that's when I'm really frustrated. With my book, 1 in a Million, I literally had finished the book, that first draft, in a couple of months, and it took me an entire month to write the last 3 chapters, because I couldn't figure out which direction to go. And that's the one book I literally just went through every chapter, gave a quick synopsis to my husband, who is not a writer, who doesn't even want to be a writer. He's the first person to tell you that. But when I told him this, and this, and he's like, what about this? It ended up being one of my best endings that I think that I wrote. And then for me, on a different level, even after all these years, it is that fear that this will be your worst book, and that your readers will say it's time for you to give it up. You worry about that until that book is released, and you start to hear the feedback. So you still have that fear no matter how much time passes.
Well, kind of along those lines, you've both written series. Mm-hmm. How hard is it to know when to wind up a series? Do you just know? Does your gut just tell you I'm done with these characters? Or?
The publisher has a little say in that. But, it's interesting because hearing you talk, I'm guessing that you are what we call a pantser. Do you outline or?
Outline.
You do?
Beginning to end, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I am also a really big outliner. I don't know, I've never written a completely open-ended series. All of my series they sold as 4 books, 3 books, something like that, or in Star Wars: The High Republic, this is a series that I work in, but several authors work in it, and we all know the overarching story, and different ones of us take different parts, but we've known where that was ending from the beginning. It's interesting, though, like I am an outliner, I am a planner, I believe that works for me. There are people who don't do it, who do just great. Good for you, not me. But especially in fan culture, which is where I come from, we really tend to lionize the idea like they had it all planned from the very beginning, that he knew before they filmed the very first episode what the last shot of the last episode would be, or this 9-book cycle was always going to end in exactly this way. So when I sold my first series for 4 books, I plotted out this overarching theme for 4 books. I thought I was so smart. Look at me, I got it going. Got into the second book and was like, why did I think I was never going to have another idea? And also it was like, why did I not realize that as I spent more time with these characters in this world, I would have better ideas? But the way I'd done it, I'd really kind of fenced myself in because I hadn't done this before. Now when I design a series, I make the big I still come up with the big beats that I know the later books will hit, but I don't fence myself in the same way. I mean, part of it is having faith in yourself. You will have another idea. Your imagination will spark. There's going to be something there. But yeah, that first series, 4 books, I had it planned out, and was just fenced in. The third book, the second one sold as a trilogy, and I was immediately like, the villain's plan has 3 parts. And it was just, we're just gonna deal with each of those parts as we get there.
So for me, and I do outline, but I only outline about the first half. So that's why I'm kind of a little different with it. So I'll outline 15 to 20 chapters. I'll write those. And then I will outline 2 to 3 at a time. And then I'll write those. And so that's why I have no idea by the time I get to that final 3 to 4 chapters how it's going to end up. And so that's that part. But as far as the series, my Reverend Curtis Black series, I decided to end it at the 15th title. But what you have to know is this was never even supposed to be a series. My plan was never to write a series, no sequels for any of my books. So I wrote the first book, the second, Casting the First Stone was just, to me, another standalone title. But then I wrote the 4th and the 5th book, which were also standalone titles, and I would go out on the book tours, and my readers were always as nice and as kind as they always were, but they would say, well, this was a really nice book, but what is the Reverend Curtis Black up to? And I'd be thinking, well, he's not up to anything, He's moved on, and so have I, and, this is good. And so I really ignored that because I was so afraid of repeating myself and not being able to be creative and come up with something new. And so then my literary agent and my editor, the publisher, they got wind of it from readers that they really wanted to see this character again. And so my agent said, I get it, I understand what you're wanting to do, but when you have so many loyal readers, as much as you do have an obligation to give them what they're asking for. And so my editor said, well, why don't you write your Curtis Black series, write a book of that a year, then you can write whatever you want. And so I started doing novellas. That was always my second book of the year, and so it kept going. And no matter what I wrote, the second, and I thought, okay, I'll write the third one and call it a trilogy. And when I wrote the third one, it became even bigger in terms of the requests from readers saying, when is the next one coming out? And so it finally continued. So then I did start thinking on my own, how would I want to end it? He was an awful, awful man. He was very flawed. He hurt a lot of people. I wanted to bring him full circle and show that even the worst of people, yes, can change their lives and turn it around for the better if they choose. And so that's what I did in Better Late Than Never. Now, that was 2018, and I'm still getting just as many emails and social media comments. And it's like, Kimberla, you do know that he has children, and you know that, right? My husband and I laughed out loud in January. I was posting about this book when the jacket was released, and it's coming out in August of this year, and still somebody brought up Reverend Curtis Black, and so they said, would you think about maybe doing another book? And so I said, no, that really was the 15th and the final, and that's it. And so there were a couple of other women who had chimed in. This is on Facebook, and so finally the leader of the group, that's what I'll call, she said, well, you know what, we're gonna pray for you. We're going to pray that you make the right decision about this.
Isn't that the worst thing people can say?
We laughed so hard.
Oh, that's hilarious. Thank you for that question, for getting that great discussion started. I appreciate that. All right, who's next? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, you want me to use the mic? Okay. Hi, so Kimberla, thanks for coming to Little Rock. You are one of my favorite authors, and
Thank you.
I'm so glad that you're here. I just want to ask, first of all, I appreciate you for the ending, like you just were discussing about how you take care to, make the ending make sense, and not just so many movies and books, it's so good, and then it comes to the last 2 chapters, and it's just like, what? So I thank you for paying attention to your audience and doing that. And so my question is, so when you're writing and you're building characters, how is that to build, different characters, or do they come from, I'm sure they come from, people that you know and things like that, but I just think that when you build characters in books, and there's several characters, how do you come about, making sure that each character, stands out, and that you are putting, what you want to say in the novel about the character?
So a lot of times it is based on people that I know. It could be family members, it could be friends, it could be former coworkers, neighbors, church members. The list is just sort of infinite. But it's not exactly who any of those individual people are. So you may have a character, many times I've heard, wow, the Reverend Curtis Black was so awful. That's because he represents about 10 different awful pastors that I know about. So it's not any one individual. But for example, when I was writing Sister Friends Forever, I start out with this whole, a lot of times writers will do what they call a resume of writers. And for me, it's just saying, let me just sit down and mentally envision who each character is, what they look like, what is right about them, what they're struggling with, what obstacles have they tried to overcome in the past, and who they are today, who they want to be in the future. And so I really try to make each of them as different as I possibly can, but also I try to make them relatable to everyone. So for me, example, and I've been very transparent about this book since it came out. These are all individual people, and so much of this I cannot relate to personally, but I do know other friends, family members who can. But what I can relate to with every single character is their relationship statuses. So I know what it is like, of course, to be single. I know what it's like to be engaged. I know what it's like to be married. And I also, unfortunately, know what it's like to be divorced, and then now married this time for 32 years. So. So that's really where it comes from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, next question. Have anybody out there? Oh, she spotted you. Great. Thank you.
Well, I was going to ask, ever since I read the Curtis Black series, I always thought this should be a good TV series. So is there anything working with that for a TV or a movie with that? That's like to me, a great thing, because you did it, like I said, for 15 books. The book, ended with the character being one way, maturing, growing, being a better person, and then, like I said, all the different things that you talk about within the series would be just a really, really good team. So I always thought that. I always had the movie in my mind every time I read the book, so.
And I have, and I actually have had option offers from a major studio for a movie to start kind of with maybe 1 or 2 movies or books, and 1 movie at a time, and kind of keep going. And then also in 2018 for a TV series. And so it just has not worked out necessarily. Some of them I have turned down because while I'm, want to stay in my lane, so I don't want any type of control when it comes to producing or directing or even writing a script. I have no desire to do any of that. I want to leave that to people who they really know what they're doing in that respect. But I do want to be able to look at that script and say, this didn't go beyond anything that I would have written. This isn't over and above or something that I never would have wanted to see my characters do in terms of my moral values, family values, Christian values. And I also don't want it to be so far away from what my readers have read in the 15 titles. And so I just need to find the right producer that feels that way about it, and they want to stay in the same vein of what I've written storyline-wise.
I'm going to throw something to her, but I have a quick question for you. Who do you want to play the Reverend?
It's changed every single time. Actually, lately, and I feel like I'm on to because I think it's a recent TV series, so I don't want to mix up, but Lamont Rucker.
Okay, okay.
That's
Yes.
my latest one. It used to be Michael Beach, like when I first started reading the series.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's time for Lamont.
Curtis looks different to almost every reader. I've come to discover that because I've heard so many different ones. And for me, for many, many years, it was hands down, I couldn't see anybody else except Blair Underwood. And so that was, yeah. I saw him as clear as day. But then as the series continued, and then you start thinking, okay, if they start with casting the first stone and Curtis is in his 30s and moving into his 40s, then I started thinking Morris Chestnut. I started seeing him maybe a little bit more of it. But I've heard Terrence Howard and, like you said, the two that you've mentioned, my husband always thought it should be Idris Elba. So everybody sees somebody different, yeah.
Well, Claudia, for you, I mean, I know your fans have always asked about, especially for some of the series, who's going to play who? When are you going to do a movie of this? So is that something that's ever come across your radar, or is that one of those things that, hey, it's just up to the publishing gods or the movie producing gods to let me know when it's the time for that? Or
Yeah, I mean, the truth is it is always up to the movie and TV production gods. There are people who sell and sell and sell and sell books who never get anything filmed, and then sometimes there'll be one book that was a very moderate seller all of a sudden becomes a huge TV show. I've had options for film and TV on several works, but none of them have come to fruition. And as an author, unless you're somebody on the level of a Stephen King or something, your ability to actually influence that is pretty low. You have to hope that the right people, like good people, to take care of it, see the potential, and take it to other people who see the potential and are in a place to do something with it. But it's also things like, we actually just bought something a whole lot like this. It doesn't have anything to do with the merits or the success of the thing in question. So, these things come up and you get hopeful. You're the first one, of course, that was like hyperventilating, but you begin to realize you just kind of have to wait and see. And it's really true for pretty much everybody that isn't at the absolute pinnacle of publishing.
For Claudia, so you work with both Star Wars and with Jane Austen characters. Thank you. My question for you is, how are you able to find a balance between keeping your same writing style and also still staying true to the lore of those other franchises?
Yeah, those are probably the two most extreme examples of my tendency to play in other people's sandboxes. And it's very, very, very different worlds, but the idea of really finding that character and understanding a world, those things are more related. The output may be very different, but the process is pretty similar. I mean, you immerse yourself in the originals, which in my case I had already done by being a huge geek my whole life. So had that, and you sort of weigh different scenarios in your mind, or you ask yourself different things about that world. Speaking of which, I thought it was going to be so much easier with Jane Austen's world because it was it's history. You just look up the facts. People don't agree about the facts of these things. It was did only women drive this kind of carriage, or did some men drive it too? You get really definitive answers that don't agree with each other. What was served for breakfast? A whole lot of argument, after which I finally decided it's probably now where different people eat different breakfasts, but you figure that out. You keep testing it against the original. Star Wars is fundamentally cinematic, and so I think even more about the visuals on that and the way that scenes are sort of set visually with Star Wars. Like, if you read those books, you may notice I usually have a few sequences where we drop into it by seeing a ship or a vehicle go through this thing of scenery, because that's how they do the screen wipes in Star Wars. And if the reader's imagination is conjuring up that image, they may not consciously say, oh, that's like the screen wipe, but they know that it feels like Star Wars to them. Now, Jane Austen, that's all written in terms of canon, but like any Jane Austenite, I have, adaptations that I really, really, really love, and adaptations that I have declared war on. We're speaking to you, Netflix's Persuasion. We're speaking to you. So the ones that I really like I ask myself, why do I like it? And then what performances do I think are really getting at something in the character that I see? For instance, I think it's 2009 miniseries of Emma with Ramala Garai and Johnny Lee Miller. I thought that series did an excellent job of bringing out something that's in the book Emma, but isn't in the foreground, which Emma, for those of you who haven't read it, she's a meddler. She always wants to meddle with other people's lives, and she just keeps creating disaster after disaster for herself and for others. And it's in the book that she lives with her older father, who is deeply anxious and frightened and can only have his world be very exact and precise. And it's played mostly as humor. But this adaptation made you realize, because it shows Emma as a little girl playing with this dollhouse, and you realize Emma's stuck in that house. She doesn't believe she can ever leave her father. Of course she's meddling with other people, because at that point, that's the only way she thinks she gets to have her life. And so it's like, oh, okay. And the best adaptations can give you insights like these. And so I look to those as well, and those performances help me color the dialogue just a little bit. Not much. I want to be as true to Austen as possible, but, if I imagine Alan Rickman speaking as Colonel Brandon, it is sometimes a little bit easier to write Colonel Brandon, etc. So, with Star Wars, it's like, what would Carrie Fisher say about this? I'm like, okay, now make it rated PG, and then you can use it.
Hi, Claudia. Okay, your book was my pool read for the summer, and there's lots of chit-chat that goes along with the pool read. So I'm a Janeite. I reread the books every couple of years, and I loved your continuation of it and the whole Agatha Christie side of it. But I do have a question. So Fanny Price, for me, is the 1995-97 Frances O'Connor Mansfield. And I didn't feel like the character in your book was as strong-willed as that one. Will you talk about your Fanny?
Yeah.
Sorry, your Fanny Price.
Best
Let me go
question
with that.
ever.
I'm so sorry.
Wow, that is officially the best question
And I'm
I've
a Cow's
ever gotten at a book event, and it will be cited at other book events.
You made my week, my month, my year. Thank you.
Well, okay, and forgive me, y'all, I am now just going to total Janeite mode. I love that adaptation of Mansfield Park, but that's not Fanny Price. It's explicitly not Fanny Price. They basically put a Jane Austen type person to be in Fanny Price's part. And the thing is, it drives me batty because I want to love that Mansfield Park adaptation. It's very revisionist. It openly points out what is in the novel, which is that the family's wealth comes from slavery in the Caribbean, and that this has impact on the family. And it does this in a way that I think is, it's asking those questions in a way that is fully versed within the world and yet really pins it to the point. And I think that's fantastic. But moving this sort of Jane Austen type person into Fanny's role, like that woman wouldn't make the choices that Fanny Price makes. Somebody like that, she just doesn't. If you read the book Mansfield Park, that Fanny Price, she's always crying. She gets, oh no, she hasn't ridden a horse in 3 days. She's fainting. I mean, literally, that's an issue that she's having. And the thing is, in some ways, she's the hardest to dramatize because she was probably Jane Austen's most conventional heroine for that era. Things very much happened to her. And she has this one act of moral courage in the book that she stands to very, very firmly. But every other way, she's very shy, she's very timid. She wants to be outside in nature and talking to the clergyman cousin that she loves. That's basically what she wants to be doing. And today, this is the kind of heroine that we don't see as much. And the trick in the book was sort of going like, okay, how do I make her the Fanny from the novel, but make her feel a little bit like, how do we get into her mindset and make it not quite as alien? How do we do that? And now, just to be a Janeite and get back to that adaptation, I realized a few years ago what would have made that adaptation perfect, and it's driven me nuts. The character talking to the audience, the one whose viewpoint it all is, it should have been Mary Crawford. If that had been Mary Crawford's Mansfield Park, here's the way she sees it, that movie would be impeccable. But it's not Mary Crawford. Sorry, Janeite moment over. Okay.
Hey, this question is for Kimberla. So, in your Sister Friends Forever book, who is your favorite character, and can you share behind the scenes that did not make it into the book?
What didn't make it
Yeah.
into the book? Oh, okay. So, who's my favorite character? I think I liked all of them for different reasons, but I tended, I think, to lean a little bit more toward Lynette because of what she's going through and just this hope that she'll be able to turn everything around and move forward, and that she will go on to have a much better life than she had with the awful husband, that she just got a divorce from. So I think I cared about her to some degree. Kenya I cared about because I know what it's like to have a blended family and how that's not always the easiest part of your family to process and actually journey through. So I cared about her, I think, a lot for those reasons. What didn't really make it into the book? Not a whole lot, and that's we were talking about earlier because I outlined. So for the most part, everything that I outlined is actually in the book. So.
Those were my two favorite characters, too.
Oh.
The other two, I stayed mad at them the whole time. I needed them to grow up and act right.
We have anyone else out there?
I have one more question. It's for Claudia. So, I understand that you are, like, you're taking the Jane Austen and you're writing it your way. So, when you're doing that, how do you, I'm not used to talking on microphones. So, when you're doing that, how do you, like, keep the noise out of, just like of with readers who's read other people's versions, how do you, like, stay focused to, what you want to put on the paper instead of, trying to appease to, the other audience? You kind of understand what I'm saying?
I absolutely do. And, it wasn't like, oh, you must appease all the Janeites. It's like, appease the Janeite within. Because I've been there making all my decisions and being like, what is this, going on here? Why, that was me. I don't think I could not be that big a fan and successfully write that book, because I think maybe that would become too much noise. But because I am really, really into this and ready to have like a longer discussion than probably almost anybody in this room ever wants to have about any aspect of this thing, it was like, okay, I'm going to have my thing. And so I know that even if somebody doesn't necessarily agree with my point of view, like, I understand where it comes from, and even they probably understand where it comes from. They might not give that scene or that trait as much importance as I do, or they may look at something a little bit harder than I do, but they'll at least see where it's coming from.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to come to you right here up front. She's going to bring you the mic. So.
Yes, I would like to say thank you for the 15 novels that you have written. I wasn't a reader at all, and at work one day, a friend of mine's had your first one with Reverend Black, and she says, girl, you got to read this. This is like what's going on in the church, you know, how that pastor doing down there. I'm like, do you think I want to read that now? Come on. So finally, she gave me the book, and then she came to me again. She said, I got a second book. I said, another one by Reverend Black? She said, girl, read it. And I thank you. I'm wearing glasses because of that now, because I didn't wear glasses. I was up all night long trying to read it, and every time one cast the first song, The Prodigal Son, and I just want to thank you. I have read every last book that you have put your pencil on, and I appreciate you.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's so very kind of you. I appreciate it, and that encourages me. So thank you.
All right, well, we're going to start kind of wrapping things up here. I just want to let you know that as soon as we are done, Kimberla and Claudia are going to step outside to the book signing table. So I want to encourage you to buy their books so you can get them signed, but I want to encourage you to just buy books, period, and support all the amazing authors that we have, not only here at the festival, but just in general. I also want to thank you for coming out and being here at CALS and supporting CALS by your presence here. I think now more than ever, we've really got to do a lot to support libraries. And here in Central Arkansas, we have an absolutely amazing library system that brings us some incredible programming and is a huge benefit to our city and county. So thanks for being here to support them. Keep supporting the authors. Keep supporting your library. And again, just really appreciate y'all being here. Make sure that you hit some more events. We've got plenty more today and the rest of the weekend, then throughout the week, and some next weekend also. So there's a little something for everybody out there. So make sure you spread the word to friends and come back. See us again. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you,
all
guys.
so much.